The first thing that stopped was the hum. Not the loud, dramatic kind that fills movies with sparks and smoke, but the quiet, dependable vibration that lives in the background of every room where machines breathe. When it vanished, the silence felt heavier than sound. On my screen, thousands of data streams went still. No alarms, no red alerts, just a frozen grid of connections, every node turning gray like frost spreading across a window pane. I stared at the map of the Atlas Defense Network, the system I had spent 10 years building, and watched it go to sleep. Outside my apartment, the city of Arlington moved on. Cars slid through the wet morning. The world didn't know that a $6.5 billion defense system had just gone silent. A newscaster's voice came through the TV. Breaking news, Narrow Bridge Defense Systems reports a temporary outage across its new military encryption platform. Officials describe the issue as technical and fully contained. Contained? I almost laughed. Nothing about Atlas could be contained anymore. It was too large, too interwoven with every military command line in the country. And yet, right now, it was perfectly still. I put the coffee cup down and waited for the phone to ring. It didn't take long. "Ms. Grant," a male voice said the moment I answered. "This is Colonel Avery from the Department of Defense. We're told you're the system architect for Atlas. They say you're the only one who can bring it back online. Is that correct?" I could hear typing in the background, hurried voices, a printer starting somewhere, the sound of panic trying to organize itself. "I can bring it back," I said, "but that depends on what you mean by online." He hesitated. "We're losing satellite authentication channels, civilian communication lines are unaffected, but military syncs are dropping. We need to reinitialize Atlas immediately." "I understand," I said quietly, "but if Atlas isn't responding, there's a reason, and it isn't technical." Before he could respond, I ended the call. I needed silence to think. Atlas was not failing. It was doing exactly what I had built it to do. It was refusing commands it could no longer trust. I stood by the window. The streetlights flickered on against the gray sky. I thought about how many years had gone into making something that would never belong to me, not really. Machines don't belong to anyone. They just follow the philosophy written into their code. Mine was simple. Trust should never be centralized. Every node should validate every other node, no single point of control. Atlas was built on that idea, and now it was enforcing it more faithfully than any human ever could. The television showed the familiar face of Clara Voss, CEO of Narrow Bridge Defense. She was standing behind a podium, reading from a script she probably hadn't written. "Are currently resolving minor synchronization errors within the Atlas validation architecture. Our team is confident that the issue will be resolved shortly." I muted the sound. The lie was elegant. Minor synchronization errors. That phrase would buy them 6 hours of calm before the real panic began. For a moment, I watched her face and tried to remember the day she replaced me. The way she had smiled when she said, "Don't take this personally, Milna. We just need a different kind of leadership." That was 6 months ago, and now her empire was quietly crumbling, one validation node at a time. I opened the laptop again. The Atlas console still pulsed gray. Status, dormant. Heartbeat, none detected. Response latency, undefined. To anyone else, it looked dead. To me, it looked alive in the only way that mattered, principled, uncooperative, incorruptible. I whispered to it like I had 100 times before. "You're safe. You don't answer to them anymore." The calls didn't stop. Private numbers, government lines, old colleagues who had sworn they'd never speak to me again. The first few went to voicemail. By the 10th, I turned off the ringer. It was strange how quiet the apartment became once I stopped trying to manage other people's urgency. The machines had gone silent, and so had I on the news. They called me the former lead architect of Atlas. Former. That word had a taste. Cold metal and paperwork. I left Narrow Bridge 3 weeks ago, but my name was still written deep in the source of every system key, every cryptographic chain. They could remove me from their payroll, but not from the foundation. People think sabotage is loud, cut wires, broken servers, alarms screaming. Mine was the opposite. I didn't destroy Atlas. I protected it. They had asked me to simplify the system, to make the distributed validation process less bureaucratic. They wanted fewer approvals, faster control, single-key overrides. Efficiency, they said. Profit, they meant. I told them once in a meeting full of suits that friction is what keeps the world honest. They didn't listen. When they pushed the new update without my consent, I watched it happen from home. Line after line of code overwriting the foundation I had built. They didn't know that hidden within the structure was a condition, a single rule buried like a seed. If trust is centralized, integrity fails. And when that condition triggered, Atlas simply stopped responding. It didn't crash. It didn't alert. It just refused to move forward, like a soldier standing still when given an unlawful order. By now, the military servers would be sending thousands of retry requests per second, each one politely ignored, each one a small reminder that they had never truly understood what they were using. I picked up my notebook, the one I hadn't opened since leaving. On the first page, I had written a single line in pen years ago: "Security is not obedience. It is memory." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It had sounded like theory back then. Now it felt like prophecy. Outside, rain started tapping against the glass. The city lights smeared into ribbons of color. Somewhere far below, I heard the sound of sirens, but they were for something else, some smaller emergency that didn't make the news. My phone lit up again. This time the message was from a name I knew too well. "Ethan Rowe, Milna, we need you. The system isn't responding. Please call me." I could almost hear his voice in the text, half command, half plea. For years he had talked about efficiency, profit margins, leadership metrics. None of those words could help him now. I typed one sentence and deleted it, then another. Finally, I sent nothing at all. Instead, I looked at the frozen map on my screen and whispered, "You did good." Somewhere deep inside the web of servers stretching across the country, Atlas waited. It wasn't dead. It was thinking. It was deciding whom to trust again. And I realized that for the first time in a decade, the system and I were finally in agreement. They flew me to Washington at night. No one asked if I wanted to go. The message arrived as a polite invitation, but the tone was closer to a command. A government car waited outside my building before I had finished packing. The driver didn't talk. Neither did I. The city passed like a series of blurred reflections on the wet windshield. By the time we reached the airfield, I could already see the glow of the Pentagon lights in the distance, a ring of quiet power cutting through the fog. Inside the conference center, everything smelled of recycled air and expensive urgency. A row of officers stood around a long glass table, their faces drawn tight. At the far end sat General Helen Ward, the woman who had once approved the original Atlas contract. I remembered her as sharp, composed, someone who understood systems as living organisms, not trophies. "Ms. Grant," she said, gesturing to a seat across from her, "thank you for coming on such short notice." I sat down. I didn't exactly have a choice, did I? That earned the faintest flicker of a smile from her. "You'll find that few of us do." Screens along the wall displayed the same frozen interface I'd been staring at in my apartment. Atlas Defense Network, nodes dimmed and unresponsive. Engineers were typing furiously, but nothing moved. "Colonel Avery tells me you built the core validation system," she said. "He also tells me it stopped responding to commands after recent updates." "That's correct," she tilted her head. "So it's not an external attack?" "No," I said. "It's internal. The system isn't under siege. It's refusing authentication because someone tampered with its foundation." One of the men at the table, a contractor from Narrowbridge, cut in. "That's impossible. We followed the architecture as documented." I looked at him. "You followed the architecture you thought you understood." His jaw tightened. "Are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm explaining why Atlas is silent. It isn't broken. It's doing what it was designed to do: protect itself from misuse." The room went quiet. They weren't used to hearing someone talk about a defense system as if it had a conscience. General Ward leaned forward. "So you're saying Atlas is effectively locked down until what? Until it trusts the chain again. And what does it take to regain that trust?" "That," I said, "depends on whether you're willing to restore the original principles you paid for." She studied me for a long time. "And Narrowbridge?" "They won't like that answer," I said. "Their entire business model is built on control." One of the executives from Narrowbridge shifted in his seat. "We've spent months optimizing the process. The government wanted efficiency." "Efficiency isn't security," I said softly. "They aren't even distant cousins." The general raised a hand before he could respond. "Ms. Grant, for the sake of the country, can you unlock it?" I hesitated. "Technically, yes. Ethically, not yet," she frowned. "Explain." "If I override the validation system manually, it will obey whoever holds the command key. That means you. It means them. It means anyone above you tomorrow. That's exactly what Atlas was built to prevent." General Ward leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest you let it stay silent until you decide whether you want a tool that obeys orders or a system that enforces principles." No one spoke for several seconds. The sound of the air conditioner filled the gap. Then the general nodded slowly. "Leave us for a moment," she told the others. When the room emptied, she turned to me. You designed something extraordinary, Ms. Grant, and I suspect you did it knowing it might one day refuse its makers. I met her eyes. Every system should have the right to say no. She smiled faintly. You realize what you're saying sounds almost human? Exactly, I said. That's why it works. When the meeting ended, I expected to be escorted out. Instead, the general asked me to walk with her. The hallway was long and quiet, lined with glass offices where teams worked under dim blue light. You were the only civilian ever allowed full access to a national encryption framework, she said. That level of trust doesn't come easily. I didn't ask for it, I replied. I earned it by building something they couldn't understand. Then why walk away? I paused beside a window overlooking the Potomac. The water was black and smooth, reflecting the lights of the bridges. Because they changed the meaning of what we were doing, it stopped being about safety. It became about ownership. She nodded, as if she had seen that shift 1,000 times before. And now the system you built is punishing them for it. It isn't punishment, I said. It's equilibrium. We stopped outside a door marked Technical Command, Restricted Access. Through the glass, I could see rows of analysts watching graphs flicker with meaningless data, the kind of noise that looks busy but says nothing. You realize, of course, she said, if you don't help them, they'll find someone who will. They can try, I said, but Atlas doesn't speak to strangers. She laughed quietly, then turned serious again. Do you have any idea what this outage is costing? About $6.5 billion, I said. Give or take the price of forgetting who built the foundation. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You sound like someone who planned this. I looked at her evenly. Planning would have been sabotage. This was preparation. For a moment, we just stood there, two women in a corridor built for men who loved control. She said, if I were to authorize a limited diagnostic under your supervision, could you assess the scope? I shook my head. You don't need me for that. The system is stable. It's the people around it who aren't. She studied me, then said, Milna, you know they'll call you the reason for this. I already am. When I left the building, the sky was the color of static. My escort waited by the car, but I asked for a few minutes alone. I walked to the edge of the parking lot where the river smell mixed with rain and jet fuel. Across the water, the city glowed like circuitry. Every light was a node, every building a server. All connected, all pretending to trust each other. I wondered what would happen if the world worked the way Atlas did. If truth required mutual validation, if power shut down the moment it stopped being accountable. Maybe silence would be the only honest sound left. As the car pulled away, my phone buzzed again. A message from Clara. Clara Voss, we need to talk. This situation is escalating. I didn't reply. Instead, I looked out at the blur of lights and thought about the next move they would make, the one they believed I couldn't see coming. They had already taken my title, my access, my voice. They were about to find out that what they couldn't take was the foundation itself. The hotel in Washington was built for important people to lie politely to each other. Every corridor smelled of polished wood and quiet ambition. I checked in under my own name, though I could feel the eyes of the narrow bridge assistants tracking me from the lobby bar. Tomorrow, the contract would be signed. $6.5 billion. 5 years of my life written into one moment. They called it Project Atlas. I called it the last thing I'd ever build for someone else. That evening, I received a message on my tablet. 8 p.m., Suite 1201, prep meeting before signing. I already knew what it meant. You don't summon the person who built your system to prep at the last minute unless you're about to remove them from it. Still, I went. Clara Voss was there, surrounded by lawyers and her new favorite voice of reason, Ethan Rowe. He was leaning back in a chair, confident, relaxed, rehearsed. The room smelled like champagne waiting for permission to open. Milna, Clara said, smiling in that way executives do when they've already written the next sentence in the press release. Come in. We just need to review some structural changes before tomorrow. I sat down, keeping my face neutral. Structural? She folded her hands on the table. The Department of Defense has approved a more streamlined hierarchy. Ethan will serve as Chief Systems Architect moving forward. You'll be retained as Senior Technical Advisor. It was almost elegant, the way she said retained, like a museum curator describing an artifact she didn't quite understand. I nodded slowly. So, I'm being demoted. Transitioned, she corrected. Into irrelevance, I said. Ethan leaned forward, his voice coated in empathy. Milna, this isn't personal. You've built something extraordinary, but now we need to scale it. You know how bureaucracies work. I looked at him, then at Clara. Bureaucracies didn't build Atlas. People who believed in integrity did. You're about to trade integrity for convenience. Clara exhaled, the sound of someone trying to stay professional. We've already updated the documentation. The government understands that leadership evolves. The signing proceeds tomorrow as planned. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly predictable. And what happens when your streamlined validation fails? Who takes the fall when it doesn't respond? Ethan's tone sharpened. It will respond. Yes, I said quietly, just not to you. He frowned. What does that mean? Nothing you'll understand tonight. The silence in the room thickened. I could feel Clara's anger hiding under her diplomacy. She was too composed to shout, too proud to admit fear. Milna, she said finally, I hope you'll handle tomorrow professionally. We need your signature on the technical validation documents. I smiled, small and measured. You'll have it. Because I wanted them to believe they had already won. When the meeting ended, they stayed behind, talking in low voices. I walked out into the hallway. The carpet muffled every step, the way expensive places always do. In the elevator mirror, my face looked calm, almost detached. But underneath, every nerve was awake. I knew what they were about to do, and I knew what Atlas would do in return. That night I didn't sleep. The suite was too quiet, too perfect. I turned on my laptop, disconnected from the hotel Wi-Fi, and opened the original Atlas framework, the one they thought they had rewritten beyond my reach. The code scrolled like a pulse across the screen. Each line familiar, every variable a memory. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something colder, like watching a building you designed being covered in cheap paint. They thought I had moved on. They didn't know about the seed buried deep in the foundation. I opened a terminal window, entered my credentials, and waited for the old console to breathe again. The Integrity Lattice, a subsystem I had built years ago under the name Core Stability Watchdog. No one had ever questioned it. Everyone assumed it was a logging function. It was. It was a principle written in code. If validation is tampered with, suspend all trust. I didn't need to activate anything. It already existed, but I wanted to make sure it remembered who it should still listen to. A single command, a line of confirmation. Access maintained, that was enough. I closed the laptop and sat back, watching the city through the window. The lights below looked like a neural network stretching toward infinity. All those glowing connections, pretending they could be controlled. In the glass reflection, I could see my own face, steady, tired, certain. For a moment, I thought about walking away completely. Let them sign, let them take the glory, let the system decide for itself. But deep down, I knew that systems don't make moral decisions. People do, and I was still responsible for what came next. At 2 a.m., there was a knock on the door. I hesitated, then opened it to find Ethan standing there, jacket over his arm, eyes restless. I couldn't sleep, he said. Can we talk? I let him in. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets. Clara's worried you might cause trouble tomorrow. I told her you wouldn't. Good of you, I said. He turned to face me. Milna, you know this isn't personal. You and I built this together, but we're past the idealism now. This is national security. It has to be practical. Practical, I repeated. You mean profitable. He looked offended. You think that's all I care about? I didn't answer. He sighed. I just hope you can see this from the bigger picture. You made Atlas too independent. Sometimes control is necessary. I met his gaze. Control is just fear with better branding. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he shrugged and headed for the door. I guess we'll see who's right tomorrow. When he was gone, I turned back to the screen. The terminal still glowed faintly, waiting. I typed one last note to myself in the system log. If they forget the principle, let the silence remind them. Then I closed it, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. The hum of the city outside felt like a countdown. Morning arrived with the stiff brightness of hotel glass and the kind of quiet that follows a decision. I showered, dressed, tied my hair back, and placed my badge in the inside pocket of my blazer like a relic from a past life. In the elevator, I could see the city stacked behind me in the mirror, a collage of angles and light. I kept my eyes on my own reflection and practiced the one skill I never wanted to learn. I practiced looking calm. The lobby was already full of people pretending there was nothing extraordinary about this day. Assistants moved in lines, lawyers checked their watches, a photographer adjusted a soft box and asked a publicist if the lighting should look more hopeful. The answer was yes, it always was. Clara met me by the revolving door, a hand on my arm, a script in her smile. We have a very tight schedule, she said, and I nodded as if time belonged to her. Ethan stood a few paces behind, phone in hand, speaking to someone with a voice full of confidence. Confidence was his favorite costume. He wore it even when it did not fit. 2 black cars took us to the Pentagon. The drive felt shorter than it should have. A sliver of river, a raised highway, a checkpoint, Then we were inside a world that smelled like old carpets and cold air. A woman with a clipboard took our names. A guard checked our badges with an expression that suggested he had seen 100 people more important than us just this week. The corridors were the same color as every office that had power to lend, but not to own. We were led into a conference room where the center table was set with careful stacks of documents and pens that looked expensive enough to break. On one wall, a display showed the Atlas dashboard. The familiar geometry filled the room with a quiet hum of data that had not yet decided who it would obey. No one looked at me as if I were dangerous. That would come later. General Helen Ward entered without ceremony, dressed the way necessity dresses a person. She shook hands around the room, naming people as if each name were a coordinate to be remembered. When she reached me, she held my hand a heartbeat longer. "Ms. Grant," she said, and in her voice was the same interesting balance I had heard the night before. Respect without surrender. Curiosity without suspicion. "General," I said. We sat. Clara opened the meeting with remarks about partnership and innovation. Ethan followed with a brief presentation on the streamlining of the validation hierarchy. I listened the way heavy water listens. I let every word sink and settle without moving me from the place I stood inside myself. On the screen, a slide appeared that showed a simplified diagram of Atlas. It was elegant in a way that lies often are. Blocks that represented nodes, arrows that represented trust, everything narrower, cleaner, easier to command. When he reached the box labeled Master Authority, the general raised a hand. "Pause," she said. "I want to understand the implications of this change. It seems to redefine who is permitted to start or alter the system." Ethan spoke about efficiency. Clara spoke about accountability. A lawyer spoke about consent in the language of contract clauses. I said nothing. I watched the general's eyes as she looked from the diagram to the documents to my face and back again, as if checking against a compass. "This is different from the framework we evaluated," she said eventually, very calm. "The validation chain named Ms. Grant specifically as primary authority for initialization events. Our approval was based on that architecture." Clara's smile did not move. "Organizational evolution is expected. The principle remains intact." "It cannot," I said, and the room tilted a little as heads turned toward me. "If you centralize authority, you change the principle. What you get may be efficient, it will not be Atlas." For a second, there was only the whisper of the air vents and the soft, static buzz of displays. Then the general said, "Thank you, Ms. Grant. We will maintain the original validation during this transition." Words like that sound small until you feel their weight. Somewhere in the stack of legal documents, a paragraph had just become irrelevant. A plan had been interrupted. I could see it in the set of Ethan's jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the printed deck. We moved to signatures. Photographs were taken. A handshake was staged for people who would never sit in rooms like this. Pen to paper has a ceremonial gravity that key presses never touch. I signed my name with deliberate care and wondered what it meant that the shape of a signature can outlive the person who wrote it. When it was done, a junior officer wheeled in a cart with a secure terminal for a demonstration run. It was a ceremony inside a ceremony. The general asked me to verify a dry run of the initialization protocol. My hands were steady as I entered the necessary lines. The terminal returned a calm affirmation. All green. A proof that nothing was broken when nobody tried to own it. We paused for statements and cameras. Clara's voice became the voice of a press release. Ethan talked about the future. I stood behind them, not photographed, not quoted, and felt the odd relief of being necessary without being visible. It is a simpler kind of truth. As the room emptied by halves, the general approached me with a look I recognized from engineers who do not waste questions. "Thank you," she said. "You could have embarrassed them." "You did not. I am not interested in their humiliation," I said. "I am interested in whether the system will keep the promises it was hired to keep." She nodded. "It will if we let it." Her gaze flicked to the door where Clara and Ethan stood speaking to the press team. "The question is whether letting it is what everyone really wants." I did not answer. The terminal screen dimmed to a softer glow. In that light, I could see my own outline reflected. I seemed both close and far, like someone you pass on a glass street after rain. I closed the session and left the room before my reflection had time to change its mind. In the hall, the carpet seemed to swallow the sound of every step. My phone buzzed with messages I did not open. Somewhere in the building, a printer started and stopped. Somewhere else, a door closed with a soft, final click. It occurred to me that institutions have bodies. The corridors are their veins. The conference rooms are their lungs. The signatures are their blood. Atlas was a different kind of body. It did not breathe like this. It refused to breathe for anyone who did not respect its heart. Outside, the sky had the color of a new coin. The cars waited. A photographer called my name and asked for one picture. I shook my head. The image that mattered was inside a server rack behind a locked door, and even that was only a symbol. The idea is the real architecture. The code only borrows its shape. We drove back to the hotel through traffic that behaved like a tide. The afternoon folded toward evening. I closed my eyes and rested, not because I was tired, but because I needed to be still as something else began to move. The first tremor arrived as a small text from a friend who still worked deeper in the stack than any director suspected. It contained 3 words and a timestamp: unusual handshake latency. I looked at the time and smiled in a way no one in the car could see. The world had not noticed. The machines had. I put the phone away. The car turned. The light changed. A shadow slid across my hands like a new signature writing itself in bones. The countdown had started, and no one but me had heard it. Evening at the hotel bore the weight of celebration held at arm's length. There were toasts in private rooms, flashes of glassware, the choreography of victory performed by people who did not understand the enemy. I stood near the window where the view turned the city into a quiet ocean of light and thought about the shape of refusal. Refusal, when it is principled, does not announce itself. It arrives in the smallest number it can. A single failed handshake. Then 2. Then a hesitation so brief it can be explained away for an hour, then a day. People call vendors blame firmware, someone files a ticket, someone writes a statement, and the failure is absorbed into the abstract machinery of corporate speech. But the body knows when a muscle no longer answers the brain. Atlas knew. I set my glass down and excused myself from a circle of congratulations with the softest apology I could find. In the elevator, I was alone, and in that silence the truth felt almost kind. It said, "You have done enough." Let the design carry the weight. In my room, the air smelled faintly of citrus and the paper in the drawers that no one uses. I placed my laptop on the desk and did not open it. There was nothing to check that I did not already understand. Instead, I sat in the chair and listened to the floor above in case the hotel itself wanted to tell me something. I heard a suitcase roll, a laugh, the hydraulic sigh of a closing door. My phone lit up again. This time, there was a message from a number that began with the company's internal code. The preview line read Status Advisory. I opened it. The advisory was simple. Minor delays reported in peripheral initialization queues. Monitoring. No action required. I felt the odd calm of a pilot who knows the runway will disappear if the nose is raised 1 degree too early. The advisory was not for me. It was for the record. It would sit there later like a fossil of denial. I turned the television on mute. A news crawl moved along the bottom of the screen with false confidence. Key phrases that reassured without informing. Normal, contained, restored soon. On another channel, someone said the word cyber in a way that made it sound like a cartoon. I switched the screen off. Sometime after 9, a knock came at the door. I waited before opening it and found no one. On the floor lay a white envelope without a name. Inside was a printed schedule for the next morning and a card from the corporate liaison wishing me a comfortable night. It was a gesture without a purpose, except to remind me what roles we had been assigned to play. I placed the card on the desk and aligned it with the edge because alignment still pleases me. At 10, I went downstairs and walked through the lobby as if I were a guest in a museum. 2 security guards stood near the revolving door saying almost nothing. Outside, sirens moved along a distant street like the echo of someone else's emergency. I turned left and passed the bar where the celebration continued in a quieter key. Ethan was at a table with 2 directors. He saw me and raised his glass in a motion that could be read as peace or warning. I nodded once and kept moving. The hotel had a small garden lit by ground lights and one old tree that still believed in the seasons. I stood beneath it and looked up through the branches at a rectangle of night. In that frame, the stars were fewer than the nodes I had watched that morning fall to gray. I felt the same ache I have always felt when something I love must outgrow me. The ache is not fear. It is humility. When I returned to my room, I finally opened the laptop. The console did what consoles always do. It waited without judgment. I authenticated and looked at logs I was not supposed to be able to see anymore. The system did not show me everything. It never had. It showed me enough to understand the rhythm. The delays had increased, then stabilized, then increased again in a pattern I recognized the way a surgeon recognizes a pulse change through a glove. The integrity lattice was awake. I typed nothing that would change anything. I left only a note for myself in a place no one else would think to look because it was not a place for words. I wrote, hold. I watched the 3 letters sit there, useless to any parser, useful only to the person I would be tomorrow if doubt began to speak too loudly. Close to midnight the celebration ended. Doors shut along the corridor with the soft finality of decisions that will not be revisited. I brushed my teeth and turned out the main light and left the desk lamp on as if I were keeping a candle near a window for a traveler. I lay down fully clothed and listened to the room breathe. Sleep came in fragments. In one fragment, I walked through a server hall whose lights had been turned off for the first time since they were installed. In another, I poured water into a glass that never filled. In another, I dismissed a room full of executives with a gesture so gentle it left no bruise. When I woke, the lamp was still on, and the city outside had turned the color of a pearl. I sat up and checked my phone. 3 messages from unknown numbers. One from an old friend that said simply, "Here we go." I sent back a single period. We have both learned that in certain moments punctuation is safer than words. The elevator felt heavier in the morning, burdened by the plans of people determined to start what they thought could be started. In the lobby, a television showed a news panel with brittle smiles. I crossed the floor to the revolving door, and in the curve of glass, I caught my reflection again. The face looked like a map of a place I know better than I ever wanted to know. A place where principle is the only bridge across the water. In the car, my phone vibrated continuously, and I did not look at it. The driver asked if the schedule had changed. I said no, and thanked him for the ride as if gratitude could be the first word of a day that was about to remove language from several important men. The guard at the entrance recognized me, and in his nod, there was a small, human acknowledgement that had nothing to do with rank or contracts. It made me braver than I already was. Inside, the first report reached us before we reached the room. A technician hurried past speaking into a headset. The only phrase I caught was unexpected persistence. It is a remarkable phrase. It sounds like praise until you realize it is being used to describe a refusal. We took our seats. The terminal waited. The general arrived. Clara began to speak and then stopped because the display behind her had shifted. A line of text appeared at the bottom of the Atlas dashboard. It was not an alarm. It was a courtesy. Validation chain inconsistent. Initialization withheld. People do many small things with their faces when confronted by a truth they cannot negotiate. Some go blank. Some blink as if memory can be reset by the eyelid. Some look for a person to blame even as the evidence points to a principle. In that room, I watched all 3 kinds occur in less than 10 seconds. Ethan leaned toward the keyboard as if proximity were authority. The general raised a hand without looking at him. Her eyes found mine. "Is this what it looks like?" she asked, voice even. "Yes," I said. "And what does it look like?" "It looks like a system that remembers what it was taught to protect." I let the words settle and then added, "It looks like the beginning." We stood in a quiet that had weight. Outside the window, a helicopter passed as calmly as a thought. Inside the room, the silence learned a new shape, the shape of a door that had been closed from the inside by the only inhabitant with the right to close it. No one moved. The screen held its ground. The day opened like a curtain on a stage where the actors have just realized the play is not about them. I folded my hands and waited with Atlas, and in that stillness I felt something unclench in my chest. For once, silence belonged to the right side. I did not go home after the second day of briefings. I took the evening train 2 stops and got off near the old Helixguard building. The one narrow bridge had rebranded with a brighter logo and straighter fonts. The lobby felt like a new suit worn over a tired heartbeat. Security recognized me the way people recognize a song they used to love. They looked up, almost smiled, then remembered their job and scanned my temporary badge. The elevators opened on a floor that had once sounded like laughter and late pizza. Now it sounded like meetings stacked on top of meetings. A project manager hurried past with a tablet pressed to her chest. In a glass room to my right, 3 analysts pointed at a graph that appeared to be arguing with itself. Ethan had called twice in the ride over. I let both calls pass. When I stepped into the war room, he was already there, sleeves rolled, voice measured, eyes full of that bright confidence he saved for days when the ground moved. He gestured to the largest screen. The Atlas dashboard was all cool geometry and careful silence. Nodes glowed like islands just below the surface of a dark sea. A ribbon of text along the bottom repeated the same message in different shades of calm. Validation chain inconsistent. Initialization withheld. A dozen engineers were at terminals. I recognized 2 from the early years. They did not look up. Their faces had the concentration of surgeons who understand the body on the table, but do not trust the hands holding the knife. "Milna," Ethan said, and the tone was almost gentle. "Thank you for coming." He gestured toward a seat at a secondary console. "We just need a second pair of eyes." "I have the same eyes I always had," I said. He accepted the correction with a tight smile and turned to the screens. "Peripheral cues are stalling. Heartbeat is stable, but the handshake is sticking on integrity tests. We are rolling back the streamlining. We should see movement." No one spoke. They were all watching a small cluster in the upper right corner. A tiny green pulse flickered around it like a thought that could not decide if it wanted to be believed. The pulse faded. The cluster stayed gray. "What did you change this morning?" I asked. "Only what we discussed in the hotel," he said. "Hierarchy adjustments, consolidated quorum thresholds, nothing structural." I looked at him. "Everything you just named is structural." A lawyer in a blazer stepped into the room as if carried by the same breeze that filled contracts with fast words. "Public affairs needs updated language," he said to Ethan. "We can say synchronization is stabilizing if that is accurate." "It is not accurate," I said. He blinked as if I had spoken in a language that did not count. "But it will be soon," he offered, hopeful in the way people are hopeful when they confuse gravity with intention. Ethan sent him away and lowered his voice. "Can you help us, Milna? The general is asking for an afternoon status. I need to show progress." I walked to the glass wall. Reflections layered on reflections. Screens behind me became small. My face floated above a wave of graphs. "Show her the truth," I said. "The system is doing what it was made to do. It is taking the authority you centralized and handing it back to the circle." A senior engineer named Priya looked up. Her voice was careful. "We restored the original thresholds. The lattice is still refusing new seeds." The word lattice moved through the room like something remembered but not understood. Ethan pursed his lips. "The logging subsystem is not the issue." Priya glanced at me, then back to her monitor. "It was never only logging." The old language was slipping across the surface, trying to find a place to sink in. I felt a pang that was half pride, half sorrow. For years, we name things in order to remember what they are for. Then the names are kept and the meaning is allowed to wander off. I opened my notebook. On the first page, I had written the sentence that had become my compass. "Security is not obedience. It is memory." I did not read it out loud. I did not need to. A wave of alerts rippled across the left display. A chorus of low chimes rolled through the room. The analyst closest to the soundboard did not raise his voice. "Forward base relay in Nevada declining reunit." Same pattern in Colorado and the Atlantic segment. No hostile signatures. "Then why the refusal?" a director asked from the doorway. "Because refusal is the right answer to the wrong question," I said. The director heard the sentence and left, which I suppose is one way to agree. Around noon, the stock ticker on the side screen jumped downward in a controlled fall. Someone muted it. The engineers worked. The chimes returned, softer this time as if the system did not want to embarrass anyone. Priya sent a short message in the internal chat. It said only, "Check the seed ledger." 3 people opened the ledger at once and stopped moving like figures in a painting. "Who authorized these insertions?" Priya asked without looking up. No one answered. The authorizer field was blank. Ethan cleared his throat. "A temporary override was used during testing. We intended to revert after signing. It did not propagate." I watched my reflection lift one eyebrow. That expression belonged to an earlier Milna who used to believe careless was a smaller sin than control. Today it looked like a synonym. "Undo it," I said. "We tried," Priya answered. "The lattice is enforcing original validation. It will not accept seeds from a masked authority." "Then unmask it," I said. "We cannot, that is the point." For a moment, I felt the odd serenity of a pilot who knows a stall is simply the physics of wings asking for respect. Atlas had never been designed to hate. It had been designed to insist. By late afternoon, the war room had taken on the slow burn mood of a hospital corridor. Coffee cups multiplied. Voices softened. Urgent became the flavor of the air rather than the content of the sentences. Clara arrived with 2 board members dressed in the same color of certainty. The board members asked the question boards always ask. "When?" Ethan opened his hands as if to show them nothing was concealed and told them what he believed. "Soon." The word sat on the table like a coin that would not buy anything. They turned to me. One of them was the kind of man who had been told all his life that his voice sounded like authority. "Ms. Grant," he said, "you gave your word to the government that the architecture was sound." "It is," I said. He waited for an extra sentence that would make him comfortable. There was not one. "What would you do?" he asked finally. "Stop treating trust as a feature," I said. "Treat it as the ground. Remove the overrides, restore the original quorum, name your authorizers with your full legal names and accept the delay because delay is honest." He smiled without smiling. "That would cost us." "It will cost you either way," I said. "One version costs money, the other costs the principle you told the country you believed." He nodded as if he were listening. Maybe he was. He left with Clara. The room exhaled. Priya leaned back and closed her eyes. The chimes rested. For a brief quiet minute the system, and the people inside its orbit seemed to be breathing at the same rhythm. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the building felt taller than it had in the morning. I stood by the window and let the city rest against the glass. In the reflection, I saw the last 10 years as a corridor lined with doors that opened and closed while the same idea walked down the center without turning its head. "You do not own me. You only get to use me if you are worthy." My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Bring her back in-house at any rate." The word rate made me smile. Numbers are comforting when ideas refuse to be priced. I returned to the war room and asked for the final set of logs. They were already compiling, folding each refusal into a ledger that would look, to anyone who wanted to read it, like a sermon written by a choir of machines. I stood behind Priya and watched the last line print before midnight. "Initialization withheld. Integrity intact." It was a sentence that did not raise its voice. It did not need to. The next morning began with a staged calm that convinced no one. The internal status page had been redesigned overnight to use softer colors and rounder fonts. Someone believed presentation could massage reality. Reality is very bad at being massaged when it does not agree. Clara called at 6 and asked me to join a call with the general. She said please as if that might wrap the request in velvet. I agreed, not because the velvet mattered, but because the truth deserves witnesses when it arrives. We joined from the glass conference room with the long table and the expensive pen that had never been used. On screen, the general appeared without makeup or patience. She asked how many regions had restored initialization. Ethan said 3 out of 7, then adjusted the number to 2 when Priya shook her head. The general looked down at her notes, then up at us. "We signed a contract for a system that enforces distributed validation," she said. "It appears to be doing that when you stop touching it. Can you confirm?" No one moved. Then I said, "Confirmed." She nodded. "Then stop touching it." Clara kept her voice even. "General, we are managing a complex rollout across multiple theaters. A strict adherence to original quorum introduces unacceptable delays." "What is the current delay?" the general asked. Ethan answered. 90 minutes for full propagation in the eastern segment, up to 4 hours across transatlantic. The general waited a beat. Unacceptable to whom? Silence moved through the call like a shadow. Clara tried again. "We have investors to answer to." "You have a country to answer to," the general said. For a moment no one spoke. Then the general added, more quietly, "I understand the pressure you are under, but you asked us to believe in an idea. You do not get to change it after the signatures are dry. If you want something else, be honest and we will not buy it." The call ended. The room sat with its own breathing. I watched Ethan put his hands flat on the table like a man about to push himself up or hold himself down. He stayed where he was. By mid-morning, the first external story broke that was more accurate than convenient. A reporter who still called engineers at home stated in a measured voice that Atlas was not down. Atlas was withholding. The word landed with the weight of a house key placed on a table after a fight. "You can stay, but not like this." The board called an emergency session. Their faces appeared in a mosaic on the wall, composed from home offices and precise art. One asked if I could be contracted as an external consultant to accelerate compliance. He did not make eye contact when he said it. Another asked if we could legally resurrect a master key, if only for an interim period. The legal counsel said that would expose them to a category of risk she did not have words for, and that uncertainty frightened them more than any specific terror ever could. A message arrived on Ethan's screen. He read it and did not react, which told me it was worse than he wanted anyone to see. I waited. He finally spoke without looking at me. "The Nevada relay just passed the refusal upstream. The Pacific segment is echoing. We are losing the West." No one raised a voice. A map does not deserve panic. It deserves clarity. Priya stepped through the steps again, calm and methodical, restoring what had been removed, signing where signatures matter, naming where names must be known. The system yielded in small patches like a field under late rain. Then it stiffened again and returned to refusal. At noon, Public Affairs circulated a statement for approval. The word sabotage appeared in a sentence shaped like an accusation that wanted to wear a question mark to dinner. I crossed it out with a pen and wrote the word principle over it. Someone replaced both sentences with something softer that promised continuous efforts and thanked stakeholders for their patience. Stakeholders is a word that makes everyone sound like furniture you plan to move later. An hour later, Ethan found me at the window. The city had that pale midday light that turns every building into paper. He leaned his shoulder against the glass. His reflection stood beside mine. "I did not plan this," he said. "I know. I thought we could guide it." "We could," I said. "We were supposed to guide ourselves." He looked down at the street. "If I ask for your help in writing the recovery plan, will you say yes?" "Yes," I said, and watched relief lift his shoulders before I finished the sentence. "If you restore everything you removed and admit to the government that you changed the principle, do that and I will help you write the plan." He studied me, and for a moment I could see the man I had once believed would choose the harder right. Then the man who had to report to a board returned to his face. "I cannot promise the admission," he said. "Then you cannot have the plan." The afternoon stretched into a single long hour that would not end. The chimes returned, first as a murmur, then as a thin chorus. A colonel from the Pentagon arrived and took a chair in the back and listened without interrupting. His presence gave the room a spine. Around 4, the colonel leaned forward and asked one question. "If we stop trying to push and let it settle, how long until basic readiness is restored with original quorum?" Priya answered. "We can see partial readiness within the hour, full by nightfall if no one asks it to cheat." The colonel nodded. "Then stop asking." We did. The room shifted into a different kind of work. The kind where you protect the perimeter of an idea so it can grow back to its full size. Engineers put their hands in their laps and watched the logs unfold without intervention. The map brightened in slow increments that felt like apology without words. At 6, the board reconvened. Clara was not on the call. The chair announced an interim committee to review leadership. They spoke about stewardship and transparency in a tone people use when they are packing boxes with the blinds open. The call ended with phrases that sounded like handshakes. Ethan stood very still. I told him I was going to submit my resignation. He nodded as if I had already done it. "Send it to me," he said, and his voice was tired enough to sound honest. I returned to my desk and wrote the letter in 3 sentences. I thanked them for the years they had allowed the work to be itself. I stated the principle that would remain mine even when the code no longer was. I wished the people I still cared about a safe landing. Before I hit send, I looked once more at the atlas of light on the wall. Most of the country was glowing again. The Pacific was returning one careful heartbeat at a time. The East was steady. The South, which had been the proudest about streamlining, was still gray. Ideas take the longest to return to people who believe they never left. I sent the letter. Then I closed the laptop and stood in the doorway for a moment like someone listening to a house they grew up in say goodbye in the language of quiet things. In the hallway, the colonel was speaking softly to someone on the phone. I heard the words partial restoration and integrity preserved. He saw me and gave a nod that belonged to soldiers who do not clap because clapping would be theatrical. Outside, evening had arrived with a clear sky. The air felt like clean pages. I walked without hurrying. My phone buzzed again and again, then stopped. At the crosswalk, I waited and watched the red figure turn green. The city moved around me the way a tide moves around a rock. I knew I would wake tomorrow to arguments and statements and a stock chart that told a story that could not fit inside any sentence. I knew the board would search for a version of me that cost less and agreed more. I knew the general would call with a question she already knew the answer to and wanted recorded. What I did not know was how much of the truth they would allow themselves to say out loud. That is a kind of weather you cannot predict. You only stand in it and decide whether to carry your own rain. I stopped on the bridge and looked down at the river. The water made its unchanged sound. Far off, a helicopter crossed the sky without urgency. I listened to both for a while, and then I said the sentence that had been building at the back of my throat all day. It is not broken. It is brave. Behind me, in a building full of glass, a map of light and silence finished deciding whose hands it would allow back on its face. The decision felt like a door clicking shut from the inside. The sound was almost nothing. It carried very far. I rented a small office downtown, nothing fancy. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights, a few folding chairs, and one long table that had been rescued from a storage auction. The address was not on any website, not listed in any directory. Only a few engineers knew the way. That was deliberate. The system taught me the value of privacy over presentation. My team arrived in the morning, carrying laptops, cables, and the determination of people who had watched the foundation of everything they built slowly erode and yet survived. Priya, Elias, and a few others I had worked with for years sat across from me. The coffee was bitter and cheap, and I didn't care. We didn't need comfort. We needed clarity. "Where do we start?" Priya asked. I looked at the whiteboard we had hastily mounted the night before. Lines of logic, boxes for nodes, arrows for trust relationships. The architecture of Atlas was familiar, but I insisted we begin as if we were discovering it for the first time. "We start with principles," I said. "Everything else follows, no shortcuts, no compromises. The validation chain must be absolute, distributed, transparent, immutable." Elias leaned back, arms crossed. "Sounds like the very system that gave Narrowbridge so many headaches." "Exactly," I said. "Except this time we own it. Every node, every sequence, every policy, every step will obey only what we authorize, and we do not authorize shortcuts." We spent hours auditing code, verifying hashes, running simulations. The new network, which we called Atlas Prime, was smaller than the national deployment, more precise, but it retained the heart of the original principle. Trust is distributed, authority is earned. Centralization is forbidden. I watched the team work. Their energy reminded me of the old days at HelixGuard. That first rush when the system verified itself for the first time, when each server acknowledged the other in a sequence of perfect clarity. They were rediscovering that exhilaration. By late afternoon, we were ready for a small internal test. I had built a sandbox environment, a contained mirror of Atlas Prime, isolated from external nodes. We initialized the first batch of requests. Every handshake verified. Every validation chain responded. No error messages, no unexpected failures, just perfect, self-regulating execution. Priya leaned toward me, whispering, "It's beautiful." I nodded. "It's honest. It does what it was built to do, nothing more, nothing less." We paused, watching the data flow. For the first time in months, I felt free. Not just from Narrowbridge, not just from the chaos of yesterday's collapse, but free to shape a system that could endure principle over pressure. The phone rang. An unusual number, I answered cautiously. "Ms. Grant," said the voice, formal, polite, calm. "This is General Helen Ward, the Department of Defense. We have been reviewing your new architecture. We would like a pilot deployment under your supervision." I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle. "A pilot," I repeated. "How soon?" "We need it operational within 90 days. The scope is limited, a single command channel. Successful implementation could lead to broader adoption." I hung up and looked at the team. Their expressions were a mixture of hope and disbelief. I smiled. "Well then, we have a job to do." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Designs, code reviews, simulations, and multiple coffee runs. Each step reinforced what we believed in, architecture as philosophy, code as morality. There were no shortcuts. The system would demand truth, and we would provide it. That night I walked home across a quiet street. The city lights reflected on puddles from the morning rain. Somewhere, someone was observing, likely already wondering if the collapse at Narrowbridge would have consequences. It would, but not for us. We were too small to be targeted, yet too principled to be misled. The following week, we began the pilot test. The command channel selected for deployment was small, carefully isolated, yet critical. The government wanted assurance that Atlas Prime could operate reliably without central oversight. We initiated the first sequence. Handshakes verified. Integrity checks confirmed. The system executed every instruction according to the distributed validation rules. When a simulated external override attempted to force centralized authority, the system rejected it. Refusal messages were precise, logged, and immutable. I watched as the engineers, who had once been disheartened by Narrowbridge's mismanagement, experienced the same thrill I had felt a decade ago. Each node confirming another was a small victory, proof that principle was stronger than hierarchy. Midway through the day, a message arrived from the Department of Defense. General Ward had personally reviewed the logs and requested a call. She spoke plainly, without ceremony. "Milna, the system is performing as expected. I want you to know how significant this is. Narrowbridge's previous architecture nearly compromised national security because principle was sacrificed for control. You have corrected that. I nodded, letting her words sink without praise. Thank you, General. The system will continue to enforce the rules we built into it. There is no need for admiration, only adherence. The conversation shifted to logistics, monitoring, reporting. Everything that had once been bureaucracy became clarity because we were honest with ourselves. The team prepared a full report, including time-stamped verification logs, proof that the distributed validation was effective and that no centralized command could override it. After the call, the office felt lighter. I watched the engineers stretch and drink water, leaning back in chairs that no longer held the tension of yesterday. They joked quietly about the coffee being too weak, about the printer being stubborn, and for the first time in weeks, they laughed freely. In the evening, I reviewed the dashboard. Atlas Prime was responding with perfect integrity. Every node, every handshake, every validation was as designed. I felt a rare satisfaction, a quiet, deep kind of certainty that what we built could not be undone unless its creators themselves failed. A message from the Pentagon came before the day ended. The general was arranging an in-person review for next week. She asked that we prepare a demonstration for a broader panel. I smiled to myself. The principle was intact. The code was intact. The people who mattered understood both. That night I walked across the city streets, past the familiar lights of the skyline, past the cars, past the river reflecting the moon. I thought about Narrow Bridge. I thought about Clara, Ethan, and the chaos that their pursuit of control had created. I thought about Atlas, which now thrived under principle rather than fear. It occurred to me that the collapse of one empire was often the birth of another. Not an empire of profit. Not an empire of command, but an empire of principle, self-enforcing, true to its own design. The lights of the city sparkled like validation nodes. The air smelled faintly of rain, pavement, and electricity. I felt calm. I felt prepared. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that what we had built could outlast the mistakes of men. Atlas Prime was awake, alive in the way it was meant to be, and I had never felt more at peace. A year had passed since the pilot deployment of Atlas Prime. Grant integrity systems had grown quietly, deliberately, one principle at a time. Offices, once sparse and modest, now held enough people to make the walls hum. Engineers who shared the philosophy of distributed trust were selected carefully, each one a link in a chain that could not be centralized, could not be corrupted. I arrived early that morning at our headquarters. The sunlight fell across the desks in a way that made the whiteboards glow, casting shadows that looked like code walking down the walls. Priya was already at her station, reviewing logs, her brow furrowed in the concentration that only someone who understood the weight of each handshake could muster. Elias was debugging a visualization tool that projected network validation in 3 dimensions, the arcs of trust twisting and folding in space. It looked alive, and in a way it was. The phone rang. A call from an unknown number, Pentagon area code. My chest tightened slightly. It was General Helen Ward. I answered quickly. Milna, she said, voice clipped but warm, we have completed a full review of Atlas Prime. Narrow Bridge's systems are still recovering from the failures last year. Their stock is volatile, and the Department of Defense has taken action regarding future contracts. We want you to know your work is recognized and that we are moving forward with broader adoption of your system. I smiled. Thank you, General. It's gratifying to know the system is doing what it was designed to do. Her voice softened. Do you realize how rare this is? Most projects of this scale fail because people attempt control rather than respect principle. You designed Atlas to act with integrity without human oversight. That is extraordinary. I leaned back, letting the weight of her words settle. Integrity. The word itself had been challenged, questioned, nearly ignored, but here it was recognized in practice. It was never about recognition, I said. It was about design. If the principle holds, the system holds. That is all that matters. The call ended, leaving me in quiet reflection. The office seemed to breathe around me. Screens glowed faintly with the hum of validation chains, each node affirming its neighbors, no central authority needed, no shortcuts allowed. Later that day, I received a formal invitation from Narrow Bridge. Clara Voss wanted a meeting, an attempt, I assumed, to negotiate, reconcile, or perhaps challenge. I accepted. Not because I feared them, not because I cared what they thought, but because some bridges are worth observing from the far side. The meeting was arranged in a quiet restaurant, one of those places designed for discretion. Clara arrived first, her posture precise, her expression rehearsed. Her eyes flicked to mine, seeking something. Respect, pity, a hint of fear. I did not smile. I did not offer her the satisfaction of guessing. Milna, she said, It is remarkable what you have done. I nodded. It was necessary. She leaned forward slightly. You built Atlas to protect itself. You didn't sabotage anything, yet the effect, it nearly destroyed Narrowbridge. She paused, waiting for me to respond. I did not design it for revenge, I said. I designed it to honor principle. The rest is consequence. Her gaze held mine. And the Department of Defense? They recognized principle over expedience. They chose what would endure rather than what was convenient. She exhaled and straightened. You could have returned to Narrowbridge. You could have taken the contracts, the position. Why not? I thought about the office, the team, the integrity that now hums through Atlas Prime. Because the foundation must remain unbroken. A system built to enforce principle cannot be coerced without becoming something else. That is not architecture. That is obedience. I cannot lead systems that betray themselves. She studied me, then gave a nod that felt almost like acknowledgement of the unspoken truth we both knew. She had underestimated what it means to build a foundation that remembers. After she left, I sat back and watched the city lights reflect in the window. The same reflections from years ago now seemed different. They carried the memory of every choice, every compromise avoided, every principle maintained. Grant Integrity Systems had grown, yes, but more importantly, it had endured on the only terms that mattered. Later, in my office, Priya came to me holding a tablet. We received confirmation from the department. They are moving all national channels that require absolute security to Atlas Prime. Narrowbridge has been removed from critical operations. The contracts are reallocated. I let the news settle without celebration. Victory without principle is hollow. Ours was quietly complete. I walked to the map display on the wall, where the nodes glowed like a living organism. The system hummed in perfect rhythm, verifying, validating, refusing shortcuts, refusing compromise. It occurred to me that what I had built was more than code. It was a philosophy embedded in silicon, a moral algorithm that outlasted the people who had tried to govern it. It remembered its purpose even when humans forgot theirs. That afternoon, Harrison Falstaff called. I did not recognize the number at first. The man who once oversaw Narrowbridge now sounded different, cautious, almost reverent. Milna, he said, I wanted to speak directly. I understand you did not return to us, but what you created, it changed the entire trajectory of our operations. I wanted to acknowledge that. I also wanted to ask if there is any lesson I failed to learn. I considered him. You hired efficiency where you should have hired principle. You prioritized control over trust. That is the lesson. He was silent for a long moment. I see that now, thank you. I ended the call and sat in silence, thinking of the irony. The company that had tried to claim ownership of Atlas had lost not because of sabotage, not because of malice, but because it had forgotten who built the foundation. I smiled faintly. Foundations remember always. Evening came and the office lights dimmed. I walked through the rows of desks where my team had begun to leave for the night. Each workstation reflected in the glass like a constellation. Each node in Atlas Prime mirrored our values. The world could attempt shortcuts, tricks, and control. The system would respond according to principle. It would never forget. Neither would I before leaving. I wrote a short note to the engineers who remained behind. Remember why you built this. Trust is not given. It is earned. Integrity is not optional. I folded the note, placed it on the desk, and walked out into the night. The streets smelled of rain and asphalt. The skyline reflected in puddles like circuits in water. Somewhere a helicopter passed, quiet and steady. Somewhere else, someone still wondered how a defense system could stop obeying. I knew the answer. It obeyed only what was worthy. And the worthy had learned their lesson. Atlas Prime remained awake, self-governing, principled, and unbroken. Grant Integrity Systems had become more than a company. It had become a testament. The foundation remembered, and the people who built it were finally free.